Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. I'm Jason Judd from the Global Labor Institute at the Cornell ILR School. We're going to start in just a second this conversation with two labor experts on forced labor. We're going to two notes quickly. One is that as we go along, you can drop questions into the chat. And second, we're recording this, and the recording will go up on the eCornell site shortly after we're finished. Okay, I'll start first by introducing our two guests, both leaders on global labor issues, who happen to know one another and have done policy work together in the past. First, Samira Rafaela worked as a policymaker for the city of Amsterdam and then for the National Police in the Netherlands. She was elected an MEP, a member of the European Parliament in Brussels in 2019. And became a lead negotiator for the EU's Pay Transparency Directive, its law. And she was the rapporteur for the European Parliament on the forced labor regulation, which we're going to be talking about here today. She also served as a rapporteur for the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That might come up today. And Samira left the European Parliament in 2014. Voluntarily, and has since been a visiting fellow at the Global Labor Institute here in the ILR School at Cornell. And she's been focusing, among other things, on how the European Union should implement the forced labor regulation that she helped create. Welcome, Samira.
Thank you. And
Kelly Faye Rodríguez is our second guest. Kelly was, until January this year, at the end of the Biden administration, the senior-most diplomat in the U.S. government, leading international labor policy. She was at the State Department, but before that worked on the Hill, worked on the House side, where she was a committee staff person, the Trade and Labor Oversight Council on the Ways and Means Committee. She had oversight responsibility for all U.S. trade agreements, policies, programs. She was right in the middle of the issues that we're going to talk about today. And for nearly a decade before that, had worked for the AFL-CIO in Washington, the American Labor Movement, and the Solidarity Center in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. Okay, so we want to get you to talking about your work on forced labor in recent years, but I thought we'd start with a definition of forced labor. I think not everyone in the audience has this definition in mind, and I'm gonna share the ILO, the UN Labor Agency's definition of forced labor. It's nearly 100 years old now. The ILO says that forced or compulsory labor means any work or service extracted from any person under the menace of penalty, and for which the said person has not offered him or herself voluntarily. The language is a little old-fashioned, but what it means is forced labor has two elements, sometimes known as modern slavery. It's involuntariness and an element of coercion. And where you've got both of those elements, you have a worker who's in a possible forced labor situation. The ILO adds up as best it can the total number of workers, men and women and children around the world who are in forced labor situations. Their most recent estimate is that almost 28 million people are in forced labor situations, and we find them everywhere. We find them in wealthy countries, we find them in developing countries, we find them in all sorts of sectors, in manufacturing, in mining, in farming, in services, tourism, for example. And I thought just before we ask Kelly to describe what forced labor looks like in global supply chains, in global production, I'd offer one example to ground us. I worked for years in Bangkok at the ILO, where we were combating forced labor in the commercial fishing industry. The Thai commercial fishing industry employs workers, migrant workers from Cambodia and Myanmar. And workers are sometimes deceived in order to get them on board vessels. They are tricked about what sort of work they're doing or what the pay might be. And then once they're in that situation, that's an element of involuntariness. Then their wages might be withheld for 6 months or even a year at a time, and that's our element of coercion. So you take these two elements, involuntariness through deception and coercion through the withholding of pay, and those workers in the Thai fishing industry are in a forced labor situation. So that's just one example. And I thought as we go along, we'd offer other examples, but start with Kelly giving us a feel for what what forced labor looks like in global production.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jason.
Yep.
Really, really excited to be able to talk with you and Samira, of course, about this really important issue, and certainly one for the global labor movement, but really also one that affects our economy, that of course touches on human rights, and really touches on the world, because the products that we buy are made under labor conditions. When they're made by forced labor, we all care about how it impacts us. So thinking about production and the way forced labor shows up in the global economy, I'd like to just reiterate Jason's point about 28 million people, including children, that are subjected to forced labor. Now, that stat, the ILO does rigorous studies to try to estimate, but it is very difficult to capture that kind of information. And what they've been able to track, 63% is in the private economy. So it's there's state enforced labor. There's also private sector forced labor. There are approximately $236 billion in profits earned based on forced labor and supply chains. And I think another fact that's important to think about is there are specific categories of people who are highly vulnerable and targeted at higher rates to be subjected to forced labor. Migrants, for example, they're 3 times more likely to be subjected to forced labor than non-migrants. And as Jason pointed out, it's not just in the global South, right? Like we see it here in the US, we see it in Europe, we see it in developed and developing countries alike. In the US, we've seen horrific cases of human trafficking, domestic workers being subjected, migrant workers, of course. And one case that a lot of folks in the US might be aware of, our former Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, actually started her career on a forced labor case in Los Angeles, and it was garment workers who were being held by their employer, unable to leave the facility. And so the indicator of restriction of movement, right? Documents being withheld. Those are all common factors that we see. That was a case that Julie Su worked on as a lawyer, and was able to get compensation for those workers and bring them some semblance of justice, right? And so for those of us in the labor advocacy space, we're always looking for tools to try to compensate victims and to try to deter these practices from happening. But what we've seen in recent years, again, looking at the ILO numbers, there's been an increase in forced labor in recent years, despite really robust efforts by governments and stakeholders to try to minimize or reduce or mitigate it. And we've also seen studies that are able to show that that often company market practices will allow, in some cases, incentivize precarious labor conditions, allowing forced labor, enable forced labor to occur throughout supply chains. Lots of great studies on that, and really has helped inform us as policymakers with trying to craft policies to address and mitigate those economic market practices. One thing we've also seen, particularly evident where there's been state enforced forced labor, is that corporate social responsibility programs, auditing programs, many of them are unable to detect forced labor. Part of it is how hard it is to be able to access workers and gather the information that you need about wages and labor conditions. Certainly difficult to do it in a workplace where the employer is present. But so being able to speak to workers, gather information in a safe environment, in a confidential way where you can try to mitigate the retaliation that they could experience, is something we certainly keep in mind as advocates. Lastly, I would just say you'll see there's been lots of cases in the news just this last week. One case where we had been tracking labor conditions of coffee workers in Brazil, Afro-Brazilian coffee plantation workers. They recently brought two cases, one a petition to our Customs and Border Protection here in the U.S. and a lawsuit here against company Starbucks actually for purchasing these products. And those are some of the cases where we see international solidarity efforts between labor advocates in the U.S. and those abroad to try to reverse and end some of these practices.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Kelly. We'll turn in a minute to how U.S. policy allows workers into to bring complaints and win relief. But Samira, first to you to talk about what, from your perspective, forced labor looks like in global production as you were acting as rapporteur on the forced labor regulation. What examples did you have in mind?
Thank you, Jason. Yes, I've been active from the European perspective on the topic of forced labor, so as the rapporteur on the EU forced labor ban regulation. And what has been very important for the European Union is to say promoting human rights is a priority and showing that trade and the way we do business can actually help for human rights. When we speak about the topic of forced labor, we speak about very serious violations of human rights. And in the essence, this is about solving that issue and making sure that people's fundamental rights are protected. So we have so many examples from different industries and sectors on how forced labor looks like. I think one of the most concrete and most famous examples is, of course, the situation of Uyghur people in China. So the Uyghur people being captured in camps and being forced into work. And they are producing all kinds of products that we are making use of on a daily basis. Think, for example, on solar panels, but also think about the clothes that we are wearing. And it's being sold for a relatively low price. And at the same time, these people do not earn anything. I mean, they don't have their freedom. They can't move in freedom. And this is a situation that has really touched me also back then as a lawmaker. So I had the opportunity to speak to people, to speak to family members of Uyghur people who work in these camps, and people who do not know where their family members are. And at the same time, terrible testimonies about the working conditions and the extreme violations of Uyghur people. I think that is one of the most concrete examples that we now have. And it is very important that the European Union, but also other countries, are specifically going to target these kind of geographic areas where we also find the specific situation element of state-imposed forced labor. But another good example is, for example, cotton. I mean, we all have it in our clothes. We all have it in our in the stuff that we use at home. Also, when it comes to the cotton industry in Turkmenistan, for example, this is a really extreme example. So where people are being forced into working on cotton, and also child labor is a big issue here, a big problem identified as such when it comes to the long working hours, and people do not earn a lot, actually sometimes not at all. And also here the role of the government is very serious. Also here you see that the government is actually playing into that and is actually not helping protecting fundamental rights of people. So I'm giving two examples of countries, of regions, of people that are involved in forced labor, and how we are basically globally also facilitating that by not demanding reform. And this is exactly where the new EU forced labor regulation needs to play a role, but where we also need to have a global approach to the global supply chain, as in making sure that we ban forced labor and exploitation from global supply chain.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you, Samira. Um, so Kelly, back to you. Could you talk a little bit about, tell us what are the elements of the U.S. government's policy, or at least in your time at the State Department and the Biden administration? What were the key elements of the policy, and tell us a little bit about where it came from, because over the last 10 years, attention to forced labor has grown enormously. I mean, 20 years ago, it was not. It was relatively little known. So tell us sort of where did it come from, and what are the important pieces of it in U.S. policy?
Sure. I mean, so under the Biden administration, we really had an unprecedented whole of government approach to addressing forced labor, to utilizing the laws available to try to end it, to report the cases where we found it. And we relied on various agencies. State Department had a role, of course. We had our ambassador for trafficking, to combat trafficking, human trafficking, and her office. And they did a lot of documentation, reporting, annual reporting on those efforts. My office, International Labor Affairs Office, did a range of work to promote labor rights, and it, of course, included forced labor efforts. We work closely with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and their labor team on enforcing trade-related forced labor policies. And of course, the U.S. Department of Labor and their International Labor Affairs Bureau had a whole team of experts dedicated to forced labor efforts, also reporting and programming to try to end it, document and end it. So what we've seen, though, in recent years is overwhelming bipartisan support from Congress for efforts to end child and forced labor. And we had key pieces of legislation. The Tariff Act, Section 307, prohibits the importation of goods made wholly or in part with forced labor. However, historically, there was a loophole that prevented it from being actually utilized. About 10 years ago, maybe, little less, there was a legislative effort to close that loophole. Senator Sherrod Brown's office and Ways and Means folks were able to finally have that law be used and utilized to hold companies accountable. And the authority for implementing that legislation is Customs and Border Protection at DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And so there's an office there. They've got a whole trade team, but they also have a specific team that focuses on the forced labor implementation piece, essentially blocking goods that are imported from abroad into the U.S. when there is reasonable evidence suggesting that it's been made with forced labor. So since that time, through the Obama administration and the first Trump term, the law had started to really be used more. I would say under the first Trump administration, it was used quite a bit, and many goods were blocked. And the way it's done, it's called a withhold release order. CBP issues a withhold release order and physically detains the products. And the importer has a certain amount of time, 30 or 45 days, to try to show evidence that that the product actually is not made with forced labor. Otherwise, it never will come in, right? And right now, CBP has, I believe, 51 active withhold release orders and 9 findings. And you can find this on their website. They have a map and they show where the products are coming from. And what's, I think, important to know about the enforcement piece is that they really rely on civil society, experts, academics, advocates, lawyers, to be able to help gather that information. As I mentioned at the outset, it's really difficult to be able to gather traditional documentation that shows the forced labor is occurring, in part because workers themselves may not, often are not aware that the practice, the horrible labor conditions they're facing would qualify under, for forced labor, and that they might be able to use that for their benefit to try to get better conditions. So, so it's really important, the work that CBP and government does with civil society, as well as businesses, to try to enforce Section 307. It's a really important rule. It's a really important law, again, with bipartisan support. And there's been a lot of work done to share that with like-minded countries. I know other countries have explored similar policies. The other important law is the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which was passed in 2021, I believe. And it essentially, it's unprecedented in its enforcement piece, because it basically establishes that there's a rebuttable presumption that any product, well, products under specific categories, but any of those products that come from the Xinjiang region in China, or have inputs from that region, are made with forced labor and will be blocked. In this case as well, importers are able to, they have time to try to prove or demonstrate that it is not, that their products do not have inputs made with forced labor. But this law came about because of the overwhelming documentation about the PRC's state-enforced practices, forced labor of Uyghur and other ethnic minorities in China, and the state labor transfer systems that they've developed over the years to move Uyghurs from Xinjiang to other parts of the country, to factories, to agricultural production, a range of different sectors and businesses. There was such outrage over this government practice in China that the U.S. government decided to take this effort, pass this legislation, and it also included resources for the interagency, for the U.S. government to be able to enforce it. And so in the last 3 years, there have been 15,000 detentions of products under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And those products add up to about $3.6 billion in value. And so it really changed the game in terms of business practices. It really forced companies to have to change their supply chains and be more rigorous and thorough in their efforts to avoid profiteering from forced labor in China. But it's been a really important effort, and we've through that work been able to engage other countries as well to try to adopt similar measures. The last thing I do want to share is in remediation, and this goes back to WROs and sort of the product or country-specific blocking of goods outside of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So when there are withhold release orders, CBP is able to investigate, they engage with the companies throughout the supply chain, they engage with the governments where these practices are happening, and they've been able to, in key places, get compensation to workers. And they've been able to, in the last about 10 years, get about $62 million worth of compensation to workers based on using this law, these laws, the Tariff Act, to be able to end forced labor practices and really remediate egregious labor practices and supply chains, and come out on the other side and have businesses flourish without subjecting their workers to these terrible conditions. So we've seen a real evolution in U.S. policymaking and enforcement around forced labor. We certainly have an enforcement-focused approach, because what we've seen in other places and other efforts hasn't worked as well.
Yeah. All right, good. Thank you, Kelly. I think before we're done, we'll come back to this question of how importers or companies, how their behavior is changing as a result of this sort of decades-long effort to prevent forced labor-made goods coming in. And we'll talk too about how we think the new administration in Washington, the Trump people, are approaching the problem. But first, let's go to the other side of the water. Samira, could you talk about what the approach has been in Brussels, and how the forced labor regulation was designed and shaped up, because it differs from the U.S. approach, and differs too from other efforts that were built largely around voluntary reporting by companies. Tell us how you put it together.
Sure. I think it is important to start a little bit with historical context. So as many people might know, we have also introduced in the European Union the so-called Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, also known as CSDDD. That is, of course, about new standards, about new rules, because we would like to change the behavior and we would like to change the incentives for companies and making sure that they make use of ethical and responsible business conduct. So the CSDDD was definitely an important momentum for also a group in the European Parliament, but also for the civil society organizations to say, well, this is the time to introduce a specific instrument that will tackle the problem of forced labor. And I was also part of that group in the European Parliament that was really in favor of having a separate instrument to specifically solve the issue of forced labor, because only doing that under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive would I say is not enough. It's definitely a good start, but we definitely need a specific approach to focus on these human rights violations. And like I said in the beginning, this is definitely part of the European Union changing its own behavior when it comes to business conduct, when it comes to the behavior of businesses and how we do trade and how we would like to do trade. So we would like to prove that trade agreements, economic relations can actually work for people. And it's also about being a credible partner, a partner that you can rely on, not only in the economic sense, but also in the sense of human rights and even climate change. So the forced labor regulation was introduced as a specific new instrument to deal with the issue of forced labor and exploitation. And that was, I believe, a very good choice of the European Commission to come forward with that proposal. So it is a product-based approach. So yes, it targets specifically a product, and it's a risk-based approach, and I'll come to that. But targeting a specific product, so the whole product or a part of a product, will make that companies will definitely need to think about their supply chain and the kind of products that they would like to bring on the EU single market. Because if such investigation will be started, then the product will not be allowed. So this is about a product ban. And yes, in the beginning, we got questions about it. So why is it only a product ban? And it lacks a workers-centered approach. I also come to that. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact, especially the financial impact, but indirectly also the reputational risk when your product is not allowed on the EU market anymore because you're being confronted with forced labor in supply chain. What is also, I think, unique and good about the forced labor regulation is that it goes throughout the whole supply chain. It's about the whole supply chain. And what the forced labor regulation in the first place will do is it's pretty much reactive in the first place. But an investigation can be started, it can be triggered. It can be triggered by complaints. So everyone, for example, every organization can file a complaint, but also the civil society organizations are very important in giving input, but it can also be based on decisions that have been made in the past or even research by the competent authorities, and therefore an investigation can be started. But before I go into that investigation phase, it is important to understand who can do that. So what we figured is that when forced labor happens within the European Union, then the member state will be responsible. We have 27 member states, but when the forced labor happens outside the European Union, then the European Commission will come in and they will be responsible for the investigation. And that was interesting. So we have put the European Commission as a so-called 28th competent authority to also be part of enforcement and doing the investigation. And when an investigation is started, it goes through a very comprehensive but also sufficient phase. So first of all, there needs to be substantiated concern. So it needs to be evidence-based, it needs to be verifiable. And the discussion about evidentiary standards was imperative here, of course, because you would like to have a good case. You don't want to end up with an investigation and a decision that might have not been sufficient, also from a judicial perspective. And in the so-called preliminary phase, there will be not an investigation, but an analysis on the surface, trying to figure out what exactly is going on. So a request for information will be put forward also to the company. We call it so also to the company and the economic operator, we call it in the forced labor regulation, but just to make it more easy. So requested information will enter, and then information will be asked about due diligence efforts, for example, but also remediation. And when the competent authority decides that there is a substantiated concern, the investigation will follow. So part of the investigation can be interviews, but even sometimes field inspections, that can be the case. But there needs to be a good file, and that is really the basis for the investigation. Just to keep it a bit shorter, if forced labor is being found throughout the investigation phase, of course, the economic operator will be informed about it. And then a decision will be made, for example, to withdraw the product. So the product will not be allowed to enter the EU market. That is basically the best scenario that you can get if you have successfully filed a case about forced labor, and when such situation needs to be addressed, a situation in which we find forced labor clearly. So the investigation phase can actually confirm that something was going wrong and something bad was going wrong. But what happens then? Because you do want all these 27 member states to act on it. And that is also the power and the leverage that we have here in Europe, here in the European Union. So what I always say about the forced labor regulation is that the database is really, I'd say, the heart of the EU forced labor regulation. Is the core pillar, because the European Commission at the moment is working very hard to build a database. This is part of the risk-based approach. So the database needs to identify geographic areas at risk of forced labor, but also state-imposed forced labor, products and sectors at risk of forced labor. That will be part of a list. That information will be available in a database, so everyone can consult that. Everyone can see it. And this database is also for signaling the cases, making sure that all the competent authorities and member states are informed about the decision that is being made about the product. We will not, in the database, the publicly accessible database, the names or the details about the economic operator or the company will not be mentioned or shared, but yes, the product, yes, the area, the geographic area, that will all be shared in the database. So the database is a really strong element to signal and to inform people and stakeholders and all relevant stakeholders about the decisions that are being made. And what is also interesting about the forced labor regulation is that it definitely emphasizes, reiterates the importance of international cooperation. So as part of the forced labor regulation, international cooperation will take place. So exchange with like-minded countries. Of course, the United States is a very important one to learn and to share best practices, but also to speak about where information is coming from. Lastly, part of the EU forced labor regulation is a so-called network that will be focused on exchanging best practices, but also when it comes to the topic of traceability, trying to focus on best practices, gather data on the cases that have happened, and to learn more about the approach to forced labor.
Okay, good. Thank you, Samira. So the difference between these two approaches is coming into focus. Maybe to help the audience, you could each give us an example or two of ways in which a good, a commodity, or a set of practices is targeted by U.S. law, the Tariff Act that Kelly was describing, or the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, and the new forced labor regulation in Europe. How do you expect it to work in cases that we see bubbling up? So let's have from each of you a sort of example. Tell us how policy in each of your respective governments treats a good. I use sugar as an example. We know of forced labor practices in the production of sugar from cane in India. We have similar examples from the Dominican Republic. So maybe you first, Samira, could you talk about how the case of workers in sugarcane production in India would work its way through the new machinery that you've built in Brussels?
Yes, I think it's important to give a little bit of context. So what are we specifically talking about in India? So as some of you might know, there is a problem with female employees in the supply chain in the sugar industry, a very extreme problem. So female employees that go through forced hysterectomies, for example. So the problem of reproductive health is a problem because female employees are being put into situations where they really need to do damage to their bodies so that they can continue working in the sugarcane industry, but also when it comes to that bondage, very extreme and long hours, and being exploited in general. So that is going on in the sugar industry in India, and it is very important to target these supply chains because famous brands, transnational brands, European brands, US brands are implicated there. So one of the biggest we know. And it is interesting to see, and I think you see that from both approaches, but also here with the EU forced labor regulation, is that products that are made with such ingredients like sugar or materials, they can be targeted. So when an investigation is triggered, when a complaint will be put forward about a specific product, like let's say this specific sugar, then this can definitely trigger an investigation, and then the competent authority will need to look into that. So my ideal situation would be that for the future, these cases are definitely being brought to the competent authority to look into that, because it can definitely incentivize these brands to reform the supply chain and make sure that they have good and responsible business conduct, that they invest in the local communities, that they invest in this case in the female employees, and making sure that the situation and the conditions that they work with are ethical and are responsible. So in a way, the forced labor regulation can definitely hold these brands accountable when such complaint will be received. And like I said, the strong thing about it is that the forced labor regulation can target like a whole product or part of that product. And I think in this specific case, it will mainly be about the products that are partly being made with that sugar. And I think that gives hope. And that's also the feedback that we get from the workers' groups and people that we work with, Jason, and speak with at the Global Labor Institute, that the EU forced labor regulation can really tap into that and target that.
Okay, that's good. Sugar. So when we talk about sugar, we're talking about lead firms or buyers in the U.S. or Europe, companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Mondelez, Nestle. They're all buying sugar all around the world. So their obligation now under the forced labor regulation is to look out for instances of forced labor along their supply chain. Kelly, how about an example from the DR? Tell us how the U.S. government has treated this. We've got 8, 9, 10 years of experience with it.
Yes. So there has been complaints and reports of forced labor of Haitian sugarcane cutters in the Dominican Republic for many years. particularly against Central Romana, which was the major exporter of sugar from the Dominican Republic to the US. Their sugar comes in through Domino in Maryland, I believe, in Baltimore. When I worked on the Hill in 2022, I joined a congressional delegation to go respond to some public reporting that had come out, sort of reviving, updating reports about wage issues, payment issues for these workers, housing concerns, lack of water and electricity. Actually, there had been a CAFTA-DR, the trade agreement that the US has with several Central American countries and the Dominican Republic. There had been a complaint filed back in 2011. And from 2011 until about 2020, 21, 22, the Department of Labor had been working with the Dominican government, had programs to try to support strengthening inspection and trying to address issues in that sector in particular. Well, in 2022, Washington Post came out with, 2021, Washington Post came out with this investigative report revealing pretty egregious conditions for Haitian migrant workers in DR in Central Romana fields, in Bades, which is where they live in the Dominican Republic, the areas where they live. And shortly after, CBP was issued a withhold release order, blocking the importation of goods, of sugar from Central Romana and the Dominican Republic. And this really galvanized advocates as well as the company and the government to engage and dialogue thoroughly, robustly about the conditions there. Did they really meet the standard, and what would be needed? The company took steps. I know that CBP and Department of Labor engaged closely with them. During my last role, went to visit a year ago and met with advocates and with the company. And I think, there was hope that there would be meaningful progress towards, engaging some of the advocacy groups in the Dominican Republic that work with Haitian migrants. Unfortunately, we heard just last month that the Trump administration decided to end the block of goods. There's a New York Times piece about that worth sharing or checking out. Seems pretty consistent with some of the other steps this administration, the current administration has taken, that don't follow the protocol we've traditionally followed around trying to review evidence and engage with stakeholders, confidential, take careful investigations to see what level of modification, what level of remediations have occurred. There are still reports that workers are facing threats and harassment, and that there could certainly be more done to protect the rights of Haitian migrants in the Dominican Republic at this time. So I think what's important to note about that case is during the time the WRO was issued, it really did create space for advocates in the US and the Dominican Republic, including unions and labor rights advocates, to engage honestly and try to really get at the crux of the issue. There is unfortunately discrimination that exists, a long history of it towards Haitian migrants in the Dominican Republic, and so that really makes it a challenging issue. And I know that there have been questions around like how do WROs in the case of Central Romana and the Dominican Republic, how do they serve workers with concrete benefits and outcomes and protection when they need it? And I would like to contrast that example with another India case where there was a garment factory in Tamil Nadu where workers, primarily women garment workers, had been facing systemic gender-based violence for many years. On a tragic case of one woman worker who was killed by her supervisor, also galvanized kind of global advocacy around that facility, and forced advocates, labor organizations, and the company and brands to come together, so throughout the supply chain, and come up with an agreement, a binding agreement, a protocol, you could say, for how they would remedy, address, and prevent violations of labor rights of workers, in this case, also gender-based violence in that workplace. That it's known as the Dindigul Agreement. Global Labor Justice, a US-based advocacy organization, really played an important role in that agreement and achieving that agreement. And after the agreement came out, shortly after, there was a WRO issued. It had relied on old information, and there was questions about the updates, but in the end, the WRO was modified within 1 month because by that point, advocates, civil society, and the companies, as well as major American and European brands, had already established a practice and a framework for engagement to try to address these issues. And in the end, the workers have a union, they have a structure for addressing problems, preventing violations, and then remediating them when they occur. And there's just been really, incredible benefits from the workers, that I've had the benefit to hear directly from them. And I think that is an example of where organizing and creative advocacy from labor organizations and willingness to engage from private sector can really can play an important role in ending forced labor practices, in preventing them, and in strengthening our supply chains to have more resilient practices, sustainable practices, right? That respect human rights as well as labor rights. And so, I like to contrast those examples of where we've been able to really achieve improved support workers with accessing dignified work, even in an environment where there is, a series of societal challenges, whether it's conflict, discrimination, religious differences that exist in many of our countries, right? And I think it's a great model that we could certainly see more of in other places, binding agreements like that.
Yeah. All right. Good examples, Kelly. We've put into the we're putting into the chat the New York Times series that Samira mentioned on Indian workers in sugar. One of the articles from the Washington Post series about workers in the DR that Kelly mentioned, and then a report done here at the Global Labor Institute, an assessment of the Dindigul Agreement for garment workers in India that Kelly was just describing. So lots to read if you're interested in the backstory. Okay, so I see the questions are stacking up in the chat. I've got one more question for our two guests, and then we will run through some of the questions from the audience. It's sort of the big one. There've been since in the last few months. European elections in the summer last year and the elections here in the US in the fall have led to big changes in Brussels and Washington. So what do the changes, what do these new administrations, the new commission in Europe and the Trump administration, what will it mean for the use of the implementation of these forced labor policies? Are you hopeful? Are you waiting and seeing? Are you disappointed? Let's Samira, why don't you go first, then Kelly, and then we'll hit the questions.
I think it is very it gives hope to see how hard, especially the European Commission at the moment, is working on preparing the forced labor regulations. So next year's summer, the database and the guidelines are expected. And then December 2027, everyone, the member states and the European Commission will be ready to really work with the EU forced labor regulation. So that's when the real work will be done, and when all the stakeholders can actually make use of the EU forced labor regulation. So as far as I know, that is ongoing work to prepare for that. Of course, there is a more general debate now going on in Brussels on the so-called omnibus proposal. So that's specifically now targeting the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. So unfortunately, we do not know how it's going to end up, but the CSDDD was, I believe, ambitious when it comes to the original version, but unfortunately, that original version is being debated again, even after official adoption of the CSDDD. And we will need to see now how far the due diligence will go. We will need to see now how we end up with civil liability, how we end up with the topic of stakeholders engagement under the CSDDD. So it is very important that we continue working, I'd say, on the EU forced labor regulation, and hopefully the timeline will stay in place. What I do wanted to tell also about the EU forced labor regulation is that that there was an interesting debate about also the topic of remediation, and this is why CSDDD is so important, because we also need to address the situation, but the situation also needs to be repaired and needs to be fixed, and remediation is a very important part, especially of the worker-centered approach. So what is also important, I'd say, in light of now the omnibus debate, is that the EU forced labor regulation really continues, because indirectly it will help workers on the ground. In the first place, it will incentivize companies to change the supply, to reform the supply chain, and it will definitely look into the topic of remediation. So it will give guidelines about remediation to companies, and for the next evaluation for the EU forced labor regulation, it will be taken into account whether some kind of formal remedy mechanism can take place. So given the statistics that we have, the 28 million victims of forced labor, knowing what is happening on a daily basis, it is important that we continue working with the preparation of the CSDDD and the EU forced labor regulation as well, especially because we have so many people that really deserve to be remediated and deserve to be in a better situation. But it is, I'd say, an interesting, but also in that sense, a worrisome debate in Brussels, because in light of mandatory reporting, the debate is now about how to lessen the administrative burden for companies. But I would also like to reiterate that companies just need to take their responsibilities to work with responsible business conduct. And even though the administrative burden can be high under CSDDD in some of the situations, the burden on people is also very high, and the burden on our climate is also very high. So there's absolutely good reason to continue in the way that we started with. But I'd say in light of the EU forced labor regulation, it is hopeful.
All right, good. And Kelly, what's going on in Washington?
So I think the case of Central Romana, the modification last month, is not a good signal and worrisome. But there's limited information on WROs and sort of the implementation strategy that will come out. Given past practices under the earlier Trump administration, one would hope, and bipartisan support for forced labor issues, one would hope that there would be more WROs in the queue. We know how rampant forced labor is in our global supply chains, so we certainly know there's more to be done there. But that will remain to be seen. And I think the most important factor from what we're seeing is the gutting of government staff and programs that are dedicated to document and address and remedy, and work with companies to address and remedy and prevent forced labor in global supply chains, right? Like the Department of Labor's International Labor Affairs Bureau did a ton of work with private sector. State Department and my team did as well. U.S. Trade Representative's office. So, it's one would think that for a government that claims to want to support and defend American workers, they would want to make sure they don't have to compete with forced labor in global supply chains. But the signs aren't there that they are actually interested in doing so. And the cuts of, estimates up to $500 million in programming out of the Department of Labor's International Labor Affairs Bureau that was cut just a couple of weeks ago, the staff cuts that are ongoing there now. I mean, they had a team of 160, which at the time really felt like we could have used more. But now those are being decimated. Those staff who have spent years and have a real specialized expertise in the data collection, in the tool development, right? Again, for businesses, for legislators, for academics to be able to understand these policies and see how we address them. All of those folks are being decimated. It's a real tragedy and a shame. And we saw that unfortunately earlier on in the State Department. Thankfully, I believe the U.S. Trade Representative's office is still intact, their labor team. And lastly, the elimination of USAID. Without the interagency capacity, frankly, I don't know how the government will be able to carry out congressional mandates around reporting, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force that had been established under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the capacity that fed into that interagency entity that was dedicated to, working on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement and ensuring Mexico and Canada also collaborate with us on preventing forced labor. All of those things are undermined by the actions we've seen over the last couple of months. So it's a real disheartening time. And yet, hopeful that folks on the ground and advocates are resilient and going to find new ways to fight and push and try to raise standards for working people. So look forward to the questions though.
Well, the first question is sort of in the same vein. It's about WROs and staffing at Customs and Border Patrol. Have we seen changes in the focus at CBP? And are WROs still being issued? What are the Trump people's instructions there?
So I'm no longer in the government. I certainly couldn't speak to this administration's instructions there, but yeah, the evidence that we've seen of the modification of the Central Romana WRO is of concern. Certainly as of January, end of January, there was a lot of work that had been done that was ongoing. There were WROs sort of, I guess you could say, in the pipeline that were getting closer to kind of being able to be carried forward. I do not know and could not speak to what will happen now, but I'm hopeful, and certainly with congressional oversight and engagement, hopefully that will continue, and there will be more WROs moving forward. As far as public reporting goes, I haven't seen reports on staffing cuts out of DHS, but I'm not privy to that information at this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next, a question for both of you, and then one for Samira on reporting databases, et cetera. The question for both of you is about immigration. I think it's prompted by the Trump administration's crackdown on undocumented migrants here in the U.S. What's the relationship between migration generally migration for labor around the world and forced labor? Do we see a clear connection between the two?
There's absolutely a clear connection. I mean, if we look at the vulnerable communities that when we speak about forced labor, so women, girls, children, people with a migrant background. So yes, the statistics and the surveys and the researches show that these are very vulnerable communities, and especially people that do not have the right documents or who are undocumented. They are very vulnerable for exploitation because they don't have any rights and they don't have documents that can protect their status, or when it comes to the clarity on their status itself, that can be very vulnerable and problematic for these groups of people. So yes, there's definitely a link with that, and also when we look at the topic of human trafficking. So this is why it is so important also within the European Union that through the authorities that we have, the labor authority, for example, that we have, it is important to monitor that. It is important to detect that, where the vulnerabilities are with immigration, and this is also where the international cooperation is very important, so that countries work together to exchange the best practices and solutions for this. So yes, there is a strong link.
Yeah, absolutely. I would only add, I mean, there's also a real clear intersection with economic rights and issues, right? So we've seen overwhelmingly in a lot of places, migrants make up the majority of folks who are subjected to forced labor. They're at higher risks for being subjected to forced labor and targeted. There's some pretty deep investigative reporting around PRC shipping vessels and fleets and forced labor on those fleets, but also in Taiwanese shipping and in Asia, Southeast Asia, we've seen places like Malaysia, Indonesia, where lots of migrant workers have been subjected to forced labor practices. I would also say, on the immigration side and sort of looking at how we approached it from the Biden administration, we understood that people migrate because they are very often, they are looking for economic survival and options and sustainability, right? And so we saw that when workers had unions or decent jobs in places like Central America, they were far less likely to migrate. And that was part of the piece, is like, you can prevent forced labor by investing in dignified economic opportunities, like sustainable economic opportunities and decent work for people in their home countries. It makes them less vulnerable to trafficking, certainly, and migration, and possibly being subjected to forced labor, right? So they definitely go hand in hand, I would say.
All right, good. Last question for you, Samira. We've only got a minute left. A couple of questions about forced labor regulation implementation in Brussels. First question, when will that database go up? When will it be available? And will it draw on some of the reporting, the product of all that expertise that Kelly was describing at the Department of Labor, at the State Department, et cetera? So when does the database go up, and will it make use of what the U.S. has learned about forced labor over the last couple of decades?
Yes. Thank you. I think that allows me also to complete my explanation earlier in this conversation on the forced labor regulation. So the database, like I said, it is a very crucial part of the forced labor regulation, part of the risk-based approach. What I know is that next year, summer 2026, the guidelines and the database will be published. So the European Commission is, as we speak, working on that database. You can imagine that it's a lot of complex work to set something like that up, because the European Commission will need to base itself also on facts, on evidence. So they will look at international organizations, they will look at academic institutions, organizations, and all kinds of research that can feed them and give them input for the database. So that's a longer story. And yes, of course, in light of international cooperation, the European Commission will look at other countries. I think it is imperative to also look at the approach of the United States, even though the EU forced labor regulation really has differences. For example, when it comes to the rebuttal presumption on the DU of LPA, but also it is an export and import instrument, right? So it's a broad instrument. It works with different evidentiary standards. So there are some crucial differences also in the both approaches. But yes, in light of cooperation, best practices will be shared, but I think also a conversation needs to happen about the kind of sources that both of the countries use. Because at the end, the US and the EU, when they are being put together on the global stage to fight forced labor, I truly think that makes a significant impact. And I can imagine that with the history and the experience that the United States has, that a lot can be learned from that. And at the same time, I think that the EU forced labor regulation is really unique in the way it is being shaped. So a broad instrument with a thorough investigation phase and a risk-based approach that specifically targets products and therefore incentivizes companies to reform their supply chain.
Okay, great. Maybe we can coax you two, Kelly and Samira, to put together a Global Labor Institute brief that talks about the two approaches. What do you say? Okay, thank you both for joining us. Thanks to the audience. Thank you for your questions. There's more to read that we've dropped into the chat. Thank you to Cornell. So long.